We're continuing in our series of themes based on the Game of Thrones series. Winter is coming. And one of the bloggers of Game of Thrones, the popular television series based on the books by George R. Martin, describes it as a story where the good guys are usually the first to die. And justice does not seem to prevail. The bad guys get away with murder and all other kinds of criminal acts, yet that is part of the suspense and the intrigue of the narrative. You're never sure what the outcome will be because you expect somebody to prevail or win, and then they don't, and then that sort of turns your whole world upside down. And as well as justice, individual judgment or discernment is also important to the story. When you live in a culture like that, you never know if you're dealing with a friend or a foe, or people's loyalties can change with the wind, and one's abilities to see through the lies and understand the truth behind people's actions and behavior becomes a very important skill or attribute. One might even start to wonder, when a person is surrounded with injustice, is it even worth trying to fight for or act with justice? I'm always reminded, as you know, I'm an avid reader, and I think there was a book called, it was A Fine Balance. And it was set in Indian culture and was around the story of some beggars that were on the street. And these young people, of course, India, very much a caste system, and these few individuals who are trying to make their lives better. And I'm the eternal optimist. I think if you work hard enough and you stick with it, you can achieve anything you want. And so I read through this volume of this book, waiting page after page for the main character to finally triumph. He never did. It got worse. And so I really struggled with that story because I felt that there was never any justice for that individual. Still, I think about that book. It's one of my least favorite, but it niggles at me. Jesus, in our story today, addresses the subject of judgment and justice when he describes the woman who is being judged for adultery. The scribes and Pharisees are challenging Jesus with the laws that they prescribe as being part of the proper way of living your faith. And Jesus often went up against such rules and regulations, particularly because they didn't always take into consideration the circumstances surrounding the event. Jesus always wanted to know more, go deeper, see the real person behind the actions in a way that most ever bothered to do. He fought against injustice by fighting against labeling and prejudice and bias. He always looked for the whole person, their story, their pain, their hurt, and sought to find ways that might find healing and wholeness, just as in the case of this woman. I'm going to invite you for a minute or two to think, and if you feel comfortable, to share with someone close around you some event or moment in your life when you perhaps might have felt judged or witnessed somebody else's judgment upon another person. We did this at our 9 a.m. service, Reverend John and I, with a few that gathered there, and most of the judgment scenarios seem to surround our high school moments. The dreaded... curling, yes. Or those moments when, in often case, judgment doesn't always come one-on-one. Often it's almost like a public shaming. So if you have any of those high school teenage angst moments, if you just take the next moment or so to share with someone around you if you feel comfortable doing so. Those stories of judgment that you might have experienced. I'm going to invite us back together. Thank you for taking that time to share. I know maybe in the back of your mind you're thinking, maybe the sermon won't go on as long the longer we talk. But I don't feel any judgment. Well, it's amazing just in hearing some of the stories, expressing my own and hearing others, how even in talking about a moment of judgment, if it's something that was imposed upon us or something that we found ourselves saying or doing toward another, how we can still very quickly come into that place of either shame or embarrassment or pain. Those kinds of judgments run deep. They run very deep. I read an article, a post actually, by John Richmond. He's been a federal human trafficking prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice for over a decade. And he pioneered the International Justice Mission slavery work in India before founding the Human Trafficking Institute that seeks to stop traffickers, rescue victims, and decimate the prevalence of human trafficking today. He believes that there is a significant difference between passing judgment and seeking justice. And in his post, he writes the following: "When I think about someone passing judgment, I get a pit in my stomach. Past pains, failures, hurt feelings stream through my mind. Coaches pass judgment on my ability to make the team. Employers pass judgment on my work. And friends pass judgment on the future of our relationship. Sometimes I have measured up, and sometimes I have not. But I have never enjoyed it when people pass judgment on me. What I have learned is that passing judgment is nothing more than a measurement. Judgments are just cold, static rulers that generate a passing or failing grade. They are impersonal scoreboards that reveal the outcome of a game. Even the most accurate judgment only reveals what has already happened. In many ways, it is easy to pass judgment on others. It does not require a relationship or a commitment to the future. When a defendant leaves a courtroom after being judged guilty, the jury is no longer involved. The jury does not go with the convicted person to prison or home with the victim. It would be a mistake to suggest that we should never make judgments about people and events. In fact, judgments can provide the candor and truth that drive injustices to be defeated. And passing judgment is not the opposite of seeking justice. It is necessary, but in itself is not sufficient in bringing justice. Judgments can require very little of us and can be passed quickly from a pristine perch. They can be posted on social media, whispered as gossip, and pronounced in courts. If our journey stops at the threshold activity of passing judgments, we miss the joy of seeking justice. And seeking justice is a far nobler endeavor. After the crowds disperse, Jesus says to the woman to go and sin no more. Can you imagine what our current judicial system would do with that kind of strategy? Many of us have heard or read about how overpopulated many prisons are in North America, particularly in the States where there is a disproportionate number of Black and Hispanic inmates. Tim Grismock writes that we live in a culture of control in criminal justice. It's a new format of social segregation. We no longer focus on rehabilitation or reintegrating the offenders. It's all about retribution, not necessarily about justice. John goes on to say that seeking justice requires personal involvement, time, resources, and energy. We get mud on our boots and dirt on our hands when we seek justice. Seeking justice is about far more than announcing something to be right or wrong. Justice is about ending pain, protecting the victims, and bringing reconciliation. Justice makes wrong things right again. Our current work on truth and reconciliation is a good example, I think, of working toward making wrong things right. Our understanding of and learning about the experiences of our Indigenous brothers and sisters is crucial to us moving forward in more just ways. This past week, there was a blanket exercise held at Harcourt Memorial United, where folk had a glimpse of the story and experience of our Indigenous people here on Turtle Island as a result of treaties that took away so much of their land and their rights. Lost, too, were generations of knowledge and experience rich in their culture that supported right relationships and respect of the land and its people. We have much to learn and much more to add toward further understanding and reconciliation. We continue to seek justice. Jesus was a justice seeker, not merely a judgment passer. He tried to turn a wrong situation right. And as followers of the way of Jesus, I think that we too are called to be justice seekers, not just judgment passers. John Richmond goes on to write that our culture is not in need of more drive-by judgments about the events of our day or people's public failures. It needs justice seekers who cling to truth without losing their compassion. People who seek justice are honest about failure, but do not sentence people to a life defined by their worst acts or the painful things done to them. Merely passing judgment brings loneliness, fear, anxiety, and self-loathing for those who are judged, and perhaps even for those who pass judgment as well. Now, when I'm not reading, I must confess that I've become a bit of a Netflix junkie. Now, to be fair, any of you that have Netflix, you might know that when you start an episode of something, it doesn't just end. It sort of teases you. It says the next episode will start in 8, 7, 6, 5 seconds. You barely have time to run to the bathroom or refill your teacup, and the next episode begins without you even having to touch a button. So 3 or 4 episodes later, I could still be watching. But there's a show that's called This Is Us, and it's the story of a family, a couple actually, who give birth to triplets, and sadly, one of the infants doesn't survive the birth. But as life sometimes happens, just coincidentally, on that same night that the two are born, a baby is abandoned and brought to the hospital by a firefighter who found the baby at the doorstep of the fire station. And so he brings this black baby into this predominantly white nursery, and when the father of the triplets, only 2 that survived, comes to view his children in the window, he's first his son and his daughter, and then he sees this black child in the bassinet that would have held his 3rd child if they had survived. And so in the way that our hearts work in times of grief, he and his wife decide this is the child that they should take home with them to complete their family of 3 children. And so the story continues on, and it kind of goes back and forth from past to future. So you see that the triplets, or the twins now, and their 3rd sibling, all grown up and dealing with their own families and life challenges, and they keep reflecting back to earlier moments in their childhood and how it informed their lives today. It's very poignantly written, and the one character that struck me when I was thinking about this idea of judgment was the father of the infant who left his child at the fire station. Years later, he finds himself in front of a judge. He's been sentenced, or is in the process of being sentenced, for having committed some crime related to his drug addiction. And so the judge peers down at this African-American man and says, I'm really disappointed in you. You've got nothing else that you've been convicted of in the past. I don't understand why you're here. I see people like you every day, and I have to pass judgment on you. I'm really disappointed. I don't understand why at this stage in your life you've chosen to act in this way that means that I now have to judge you and send you to prison. And surprisingly to the judge, the defendant, the man William, stands up and says, well, you're not as disappointed in me as I am in myself. And there's something about the interaction between the judge and the defendant that something twigs in the heart of the judge, and he realizes there's something different to be done here. And so he invites the defendant in for a conversation. And so they have this conversation, and he says, I don't really know why, but I feel compelled to treat you differently. There's something different that has to happen here. I don't want the outcome to be that I send you to prison. He says, I can't live with any more disappointment, and I don't think you can either. So I'm paraphrasing what happened, but in the end, he gives the gentleman community hours to complete. And he says to the man, William, whenever you think of doing something that's going to land you back in my court, I want you to see my face and see the look of disappointment that will be on it if you don't somehow move forward in your life and find more healing ways. And then we flash back to the current day, and here's this now 70 plus William who's dying of cancer, and his now 40-year-old biological son comes knocking at his door to meet his father for the first time. And he's managed to stay clean all those years. And he thinks back to that judge who not only gave judgment, but acted in a way seeking justice so that William could go on and live a full life. Jesus was a justice seeker, not merely a judgment passer. Seeking justice restores and heals and corrects. It brings hope for a better future for everyone involved, the offender, the victim, sometimes even the bystander. Richmond believes that developing a culture postured to seek justice starts with us choosing not to pass judgment, without a willingness to get involved. Now, that's the catch. He's not saying don't ever pass judgment, but he's saying you can't pass judgment without somehow getting involved. And I have one last story to share with you. My daughter and I, we enjoy, since the Camino, don't understand why, we like walking together. So often we're out walking. And one day I actually had ridden my bike to work, and so I said to my daughter, well, I'll meet you part way. I'll meet you at Starbucks. She walked from our house, and she came, and when I greeted her, she had our little dog with her, and it was kind of a warm day. So we greeted, and I said, well, here, I'll hold the dog. I've got my bike if you want to go into Starbucks and get our drinks. So as I was standing there with my bike and my little dog, who was panting from the heat, and she's also 15, so she's getting up there, this woman came walking across the parking lot toward me, but stood on the other side of the driveway. I said, is that, you shouldn't be walking that dog with that bike. I'm standing there holding the dog and the bike. I'm not. You shouldn't be walking that dog with that bike. It's too hot. I wasn't walking the dog with the bike. I know it's too hot. And then my daughter came out, brought her drinks. Shortly after that, the woman came out, looked across, was still glaring at me. But my daughter and I were standing together, and I very deliberately handed the leash to my daughter, and we went on our way. But I thought, my gosh, there was an example of somebody who simply judged without following up with some kind of a connection. She could have walked over to me and said, my gosh, it's a hot day to be out with your dog. Oh, no, it's all right. I'm just waiting for my daughter. She walked the dog down here. We're going to walk home together. She never gave me that opportunity. If we're seeking justice, we have to be willing to make some kind of a connection. It might be a conversation. It might be just delving into the situation a little more. It might be about getting to know the person a bit better before we pass judgment. Seeking justice moves us beyond judgment. At its best, as Jesus taught us, it restores, it heals, it corrects, and it offers us all new life. Amen.